So I'm going to talk a bit about the 2010s and why, in some ways, humanity may have actually peaked in this decade. Now, obviously, there are many different metrics through which you can measure the good old days or when humanity peaked in various regards. Like you could argue architecturally, we might have peaked in like the 1600s or the 1700s. You could argue in terms of music, we might have peaked with Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and other great classical composers. Regardless, I think in some aspects, like I know a lot of people, like during the 2010s, all that the alt right did was bitch constantly about how shitty everything was. And in some ways, they were correct. Things were getting worse in a lot of ways. In terms of demographics, in terms of the dating prospects for men, especially, in terms of the stability of the family. Like, yeah, things were definitely getting worse in many ways. But nonetheless, we have to contend, like, looking back at it, in many ways, humanity may have actually peaked in the 2010s. Now, what the hell am I talking about? Well, analyzing the data, it seems that there may have been certain trends of things improving but also getting worse at the same time, where you had, for certain reasons, things were getting better, but for other reasons, the same thing was getting worse. Like trends and counter trends that were occurring concurrently. Like, for instance, okay, I'm going to go one by one and list the ways in which things may have peaked or did peak, it seems, in the 2010s. Now, whether or not they can go back up is another story. But yeah, here they are. IQ. From a number of articles I've read, it seems that global IQ may have peaked in the 2010s, or especially in Western countries. Actually, in Western countries, according to some sources, it may have peaked in the 2010s. According to other sources I've read, it may have actually peaked earlier than that. So why is this? Well, I mean, people talk plenty about the Flynn effect, which is, to my knowledge, the trend that people generally tend to get smarter from one generation to the next due to a combination of natural selection and also improving living conditions like better health and more access to learning materials, better education, just more access to knowledge in general. Combined with, I guess, in recent decades, the legalization of abortion has admittedly served a certain eugenic purpose where a lot of people who probably would have been led not very great lives and been at the lower rungs of society have been aborted. So there has been a certain eugenic impact, regardless of what your feelings on abortion are. However, with these positive trends in terms of IQ, there have also been negative trends. Like, obviously, there's demographic change with people being imported in massive numbers into first world countries from countries with a much lower average IQ. And the fact is, I do think their IQ level does tend to go up at least somewhat once they've come here, but not enough to necessarily negate the fact that overall a lot of these populations have a significantly lower IQ on average than the host country. Like, this is especially true with people from Africa and Latin America and Middle Eastern countries. Now, obviously, it can vary from one country to the other, both in terms of like the country of origin and the country that they're coming to, because some countries tend to get the cream of the crop more than others. Like how Trump said they're not sending their best. Like certain countries will send their best to one country but not to another. Like, for instance, in Canada, the immigrants that we get from Islamic countries often tend to be highly educated and people who end up in high performing white collar professions. In Europe, that is not the case at all. They often tend to be on the lower rungs of society there. So yeah, even sometimes you'll get immigrants from the same country who, for whatever reason, will send their best to one country but not to another. But regardless, yes, immigration does play an impact in that, like on IQ levels, but I personally don't believe it's the only factor, because I believe a second factor that is having hugely disastrous effects on IQ is technology addiction, like internet addiction. Now, to be fair, it's a double-edged sword because I think verbal intelligence has actually increased, like with younger generations. Like you see it all the time with boomers, how they can't spell words properly. Their grammar absolutely sucks. They put two fucking spaces after a period or three or four spaces just because that's what you used to do with a typewriter, even though you're not supposed to do that anymore. Their boomers are just terrible in terms of verbal intelligence. However, what's happening is with the double-edged sword of the internet and technology, I believe that my generation, from all my observations, my generation and the younger generations have increased in terms of verbal intelligence, but have decreased in terms of visual spatial intelligence. And we are not learning basic skills. Like every boomer knows certain basic mechanical skills, even if they're not a mechanic. Like this is true for like all the boomers I've known, especially men, like my dad, my uncles, like my grandparents, all of them know or knew various basic mechanical skills that I have no fucking idea how to do, and probably most men and women in my generation don't know. So I think you could argue, is it nature or nurture? I think the two kind of go hand in hand. There's sort of a synthesis between them. It's sort of like it's a cycle where they feed off each other. And I think what we're seeing is an increase in verbal intelligence, but a decrease in visual spatial intelligence. And I'm not sure about scientific and mathematic intelligence, but either way, what I think is happening is that because of technology addiction, it is becoming harder and harder for people to focus and to function on a basic level. And we're seeing this with like this so-called competency crisis in the last few years. And I mean, I have ADHD. I know all about not being able to focus, but I think even people without, who at least aren't diagnosed with it or don't have it, are still falling prey to technology addiction and how it's rewiring our brains. Like people just aren't able to focus as well, and they're constantly craving the next dopamine rush. And I do think that our reliance on technology and social media in particular has rewired our brains to some extent, where it's harder for people to just stay focused on work for an extended period of time. And I'm not sure to what extent this affects IQ, but I think it can be shown with declining IQ scores, but it can also be shown with just declining performance across the board in various professions. And I do think, I don't believe in workaholism, but at the same time, I mean, this isn't necessarily an issue where it's like you have to be a workaholic. It's more an issue of the fact that like your brain has been rewired to the point where like you have to put in a lot more effort just to focus on basic tasks. So in a way, that is making our work harder. Like you're doing less work, but with the same amount of difficulty or more difficulty because your brain is being rewired by technology addiction and what it's doing to you. And I think that's a huge problem that we need to look more into. But yeah, all things considered, I do think the combination of these two main factors, demographic change and technology addiction, are the main culprits behind lowering IQ rates. And I'm sure there's other factors too. Now, again, demographic change, as I mentioned, it's complicated because, yes, there's also East Asian immigration, and they do have very high IQs. Plus, I mean, immigration from India is a very big mixed bag in that regard because you get people across the board. I admit, like, when it comes to, like, race and IQ, I think the problem is it's such a censored field that, like, it's hard to find reliable information on certain things, and it's hard to conduct studies on it. And most of the studies we have are old and possibly flawed. At the same time, I think it's very real and valid, but it's hard to get information on something that's so censored. So for instance, like how race relates to IQ, it seems more clear in the case of like people like whites, blacks, or East Asians, people who are very like unmixed like what are considered the basic kind of like the primary colors of the racial groups, like the unmixed, I hate to use the term, but pure races. Whereas people like from India, the Middle East, North Africa, um, Latin America, you get more mixed regions. And I think like the nature of race and IQ and how they relate in those countries is a bit more uncertain. But yeah, I mean, those are factors in declining IQ. And again, it's not just genetic, it's also cultural. It's like you can't take somebody from a country that is just really underdeveloped and culturally backwards and just expect them to assimilate right away. It just doesn't work that way. So, I mean, there's that also. Another regard in which I think the world peaked in the 2010s was life expectancy. And we can see this in official statistics. Ever since 2020's life expectancies have actually declined, I believe, in most countries and in the world as a whole. Now, obviously, there was the big event in 2020. And yes, that particular pathogen does kill people in some cases, although not as many cases as the mass media would have had you believe with the distorted way in which they reported on it. And also, yes, it's true that the cure to the big event that was mass distributed may have also played a part in this, because it seems as if there were many side effects that went largely ignored, unaddressed, and people who pointed them out were gaslit about it and called liars, even when they had extremely valid evidence of it and like personal evidence of it. But yes, like that was a factor, but also the economic problems, homelessness, drug addiction that have all increased as a result of the big event. But the question is, if this is this a long-term trend where life expectancy is declining? Also obesity, that's another aspect of poor health that has risen since the big event in 2020. But my question is, if we're seeing such a huge rise in all these unhealthy factors and decline in life expectancy, does that mean that this was something that was going to happen anyway and that the big event only accelerated it? I think that's an interesting question, because I do think it's possible that life expectancy was going to plateau and then decrease anyway. And what the big event did was simply accelerate a process that was already in motion. So it's going to be very interesting to see how these things pan out in the next few years, which brings me to the next thing in the list, which is crime rates. Now, across much of the, at least in Canada and the United States, crime rates were actually down in basically from 1995 until about 2019. They were actually much lower in these years compared to like the early 90s, the 80s, the 70s, and the late 60s. So in the 2010s, we actually had relatively low crime rates, but in much of the Western world, definitely in Canada and the US, but I think to a lesser extent in Europe, we saw spikes in crime we've seen spikes in crime in the early 2020s thus far that were predicated, of course, by the big event and by the economic consequences of how we responded to the big event. And some of that impact has died down a bit. Like crime rates are stabilizing a bit in some places and going back to their pre-2020 levels, but in other places they still remain quite high. I think in most places they've gone down a bit, but they're still not quite at pre-2020 levels. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely a huge spike between 2020 and I guess 2023. And it's starting to stabilize a little bit. I mean, in some places it already started to stabilize a bit in 2023. But it remains to be seen again. Is this a long-term trend? Could crime go up after decades of being relatively low? I mean, I think very likely with all this like defund the police talk going around, like I think that was a huge cause of why crime rates went up. I mean, it's very simple. Liberals normally get the fact that like when you defund a public service, the quality of that service goes down. You see, that's why they're liberals. They're not fiscal conservatives. They understand that fact, which I normally agree with them on. You can't get something for nothing. Like you get what you pay for. The problem is when it comes to the police, they're like, oh, well, let's just defund the police. That'll solve the problem. It's like, no, you fucking idiots. Defunding things just causes problems and makes society shittier in most cases. Like, yeah, there's some departments that are overfunded, but like the US military, for instance. But generally speaking, yes, when you defund things, it makes them shittier. So yeah, lo and behold, surprise, surprise. Oh, you defund the police, crime goes up. Who would have thunk? So yeah, that's another way in which society may have peaked. Well, not just in the 2010s, but also the 2000s and late 90s compared to now. Um, Another regard is air quality. Now, this is an interesting one because air quality actually, I remember when I was a kid, the air quality was a bit worse. Like growing up in the 90s. There seemed to be a lot of pollution from like industry and stuff like that. And I feel like in the ensuing decades, industry has gotten better at not polluting as much. Like with things like cars and also factories and various forms of industry, I think they've improved a lot of things to the point where there's less smog in the air. There's less smog from human activities, which is good, which is a result of a lot of these environmental standards that conservatives shit on so much. But the fact is, they have made the air at least somewhat cleaner. But here's the problem. While industrial smog has declined, what is now starting to increase and get far worse than industrial smog ever was. Well, maybe not worse than it ever was. I mean, when you look back to the Victorian era, like it was really bad then. But let me put it this way. Worse than industrial smog has been within the last 3 or 4, probably 5 or more decades. What's getting worse is forest fire smoke. That is becoming the big problem because with global warming, it is becoming so hot and so dry that these forests are just a fucking tinderbox, like especially out west, but even increasingly in parts of eastern North America, like more in the north, like northern Quebec, northern Ontario, northern Minnesota. We're seeing these problems and it's just the air is becoming filthy a lot of the time. Like thankfully where I live, it's not as bad as some places, but we do still get it. Like there has been way more forest fire smoke in the air here in the past, like since 2021. That was actually the year when it started. It was 2021 when things started getting really bad in terms of forest fire smoke. And yes, I mean, it's not like constant here like it is in many parts of the West, but we do have some days every summer, like I would say between May and October, we get some days where the air is just shit. And it is because of forest fire smoke. It's not because of industrial smog. It's forest fire smoke. And that is increasingly becoming the problem in North America and making the air unbreathable from at least some of the time. It really depends where you are. Like out west, it's a lot worse because you're exposed to it much more directly. I've heard it's a problem in some parts of Europe too. I have not personally encountered forest fire smoke in Europe, but I understand that it's becoming an increasing problem, particularly in southeastern Europe, like in some parts of the Balkans and Greece in certain times of the year. So yeah, I mean, forest fire smoke is disgusting. I don't like it. I don't like smoggy air, smoky air. It's just gross. And yeah, that's the thing that's getting worse, unfortunately, in this decade. And it's especially sad because we may have gotten air quality, like air quality could have been actually at its best in the 2010s and the 2000s in the entire post-industrial era because we were finally starting to solve the problems of smog directly caused by human activities. But now it's being replaced by the problem of forest fire smoke, which is indirectly caused by human activities. In some cases directly, because you do have the occasional case of arson and then far more common cases of fires that are directly caused by human carelessness. But a lot of them are just caused by lightning. But really, what makes the fires spread so much is the hot weather and the drought, which are consequences of ongoing climate change. So, yeah, there's that. But yeah, other ways in which the 2010s were a golden era, it was the last decade before AI. I think that's one thing that people might really look back at fondly about the 2010s is that we had most of the other tech that we have right now, but we didn't have all this AI that's taking people's jobs and making people unemployed or underemployed or making it hard to get a job. Like, I can't stress this enough as something that could potentially just fuck up the entire human experience, AI. People are optimistic about it. I'm pessimistic. I think AI is a Pandora's box that we've opened, and I don't think the consequences are going to be good for humanity. I don't think it's going to be like the Matrix or the Terminator. Well, it might be like the Matrix, but I think it would be more like Ready Player One in the sense of like people consensually agreeing to be in some sort of virtual reality. I think that's actually a very likely prospect, a very likely consequence of both technological innovation and the world getting shittier. That people will voluntarily choose to live most of their lives in virtual reality, and that the elite will actually encourage it. Because A, it will reduce social unrest in the real world and possibly various other social problems. B, it might actually, I could see it make, I don't know. In terms of climate change, it could be a net positive or a net negative. Because on one hand, they'd be using a lot of electricity, but on the other hand, they would be moving around a lot less. So it's hard to say, and they might actually be willing to live in smaller homes if they spend most of their lives hooked up to VR. But at the same time, the sheer amount of electricity they'd be using would also be a factor because that's a lot of fucking electricity. And you're not going to get that from solar and wind, let me tell you that. You're going to need nuclear if you want clean energy to power people being hooked up to fucking Matrix all day long. Either way, that shit sounds dystopian to me, and if I really hope I don't live to see a world where the majority of people spend most of their lives literally hooked up to VR. But if it does happen within my lifetime, I won't be shocked. So yeah, that was another benefit of the 2010s, was simply that, like, we might have hit the point where technological, like, it was the last decade before the cons of technological progress started to outweigh the pros. I'm going to go on record and say that the 2010s were probably that point where we reached that benchmark where it was the last decade before the cons started to outweigh the pros of technological progress. I'm not going to say the 2010s were the best decade for movies, but they were the best decade for horror movies. I don't care what anyone says. The horror movies of the 2010s are fucking spectacular. I do think it was the best decade overall for television. I will say that. But I've talked about these things in other videos before, so I'm not going to go too much into it. Best decade for video games is debatable. I think 2000s or 2010s, it's hard to say. But it might have been the best decade for video games because we got it when the graphics were really good, and at least in the first half of the decade before things started to get extremely woke. So I don't know. It's hard to say, but it might have been the best decade for video games. But yeah, overall, and it wasn't the best decade for music. Nobody would say it was the best decade for music. But yeah, still better than the 2020s though. But yeah, overall, all things considered, I think the 2010s, in some ways, we might end up looking back at it as a golden era that we really didn't appreciate while we were in it. Like, yes, things were getting worse in many ways, and we were right in pointing out these underlying trends. And now in the 2020s, the chickens are coming home to roost due to these underlying trends that were already well in play by the 2010s. But nonetheless, I can't help but think that in some ways, humanity did peak in that decade. And again, like as I've said, like trends can reverse themselves. It's entirely possible that many of these downward trends are not permanent and that things will actually get better eventually. But the thing is, it will probably get worse before it gets better. So I'm not going to say the 2010s were humanity's peak, but they may have been a peak. They may have been a mountaintop followed by a downward curve. But nonetheless, there could be future mountaintops in the future that may very well eclipse it. So that's my hope there for the future, because I do think trends, current trends aren't necessarily permanent trends. But nonetheless, I do think we saw a peak of humanity in the 2010s, not necessarily the peak. But I think in many ways, things are going to go downhill and they're going to get worse before they get better. So buckle up, it's going to be a bumpy ride.